Should the Sussexes come to the King's coronation? Will a government crackdown stop the small boat crossings? And is the civil service really impartial? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP and former Cabinet Office Minister Brendan Clarke-Smith, Labour MP and Shadow Defence Minister Luke Pollard, The Observer's Sonia Sodha and The Telegraph's Tim Stanley. On today's programme.
It is important that the government tackles this head-on.
This policy is just the latest in a long line of unworkable gimmicks.
Will telling Channel migrants they'll be banned from the UK forever stop the small boat crossings?
I'm sure people, may want to draw their own conclusions about the confidence they can place in her inquiry.
The senior civil servant who conducted the Partygate probe is hired by Labour. Keir Starmer won't say when the recruitment process began.
When did you first contact Sue Gray about the possibility of becoming your Chief of Staff?
Well, Nick, that's going to be laid out by Sue. She's got to do that as part of a leaving procedure, but there's nothing improper at all.
It's a sad time for this part of the world.
And the gunman who killed 5 in the worst mass shooting in over a decade. How can the misogynistic ideology that drove him be tackled? Let's start today's programme with this headline. BBC News: Harry and Meghan weigh up coronation invitation. Yes, they've received the invitation and they are considering it. They haven't yet said whether it'll be accepted or not. So my opening question to the panel today is, should they accept and come to the King's coronation? Brendan.
Well, I don't want to get involved in family disputes, but I think it's nice when we can get on. And it's one of those, it's such a special occasion for everybody. You hope that everybody can be included and feel comfortable with it. And you don't want this constant media circus around. We want to have something that we can enjoy. We can come together with the public. And, of course, if they want to be part of that, then great.
It's going to be difficult to be comfortable, though, isn't it, Luke, bearing in mind everything that has happened up until now? But should they accept the invitation?
It's going to be a really significant event, but I really struggle to find myself caring about whether Harry and Meghan should go or not. It's really hard to have family relations played out in the public domain, as they are here, but I think there are much bigger issues that I would like our journalists focusing on, rather than the daily minutiae of a family that's clearly quite unhappy and needing to heal.
It is a big event. It's also an extremely popular, well-read story on the BBC website, Sonia. So people are obviously interested. What do you think? Should they say yes or no?
I mean, I sort of think it's up to them. I'm kind of with Luke on this. But I do think that if I was advising them from a PR perspective, I would probably say just suck it up and go, because if you don't go, there's going to be a lot of press and media attention. And do you really want that? But I don't really care, and I struggle to get het up about whether they do or they don't.
Do you think they will? Tim, do you think they will accept?
It doesn't really matter. If they say no, it'll all be about how they didn't go. If they do go, it'll be about how they looked and what they did while they were there. I think they've played it pretty well. This is what I do. Whenever I'm not invited to something or the invitation is in doubt...
I'm sure that's very rare.
Behind the scenes, I moan about it like crazy. And then when someone finally feels obliged to give me an invitation, I'll sort of go, oh, now I think about it, the third? I'm not sure I can do that. So I think they've actually played it very, very well.
I wonder if you'll be hired as their PR guru on the basis of that.
Maybe Tim's secretly been behind the scenes.
Are you going to the King's coronation?
No, I'm not. But if I were them, I would wear a killer dress and a crazy uniform, and I would show up in every photo and ruin the whole thing for everyone.
Well, I think that's a good point to end that discussion about Harry and Meghan and their invite to the coronation. Let's talk about this very serious issue. One of Rishi Sunak's key the priorities. This is the front page of today's Daily Mail. Boat migrants to get life ban. This is the story that if you arrive over the channel in one of those small dinghies, you will not be able to claim asylum at all. You will, in fact, be sent, we haven't seen the legislation, I might add, you will, in fact, be sent to a third country. It could be Rwanda, it could be somewhere else, and you could face a lifetime ban from entering the country. Is this going to work, Brendan?
Absolutely, and I think this is exactly what's needed. And you look at every single piece of legislation that we've tried to bring in at the moment, either the human rights lawyers are all over it, or the opposition are over it, or the Rwanda scheme as well. We're still waiting for that. Prime Minister said it's one of his 5 pledges. Really keen to actually get something done, and I think it comes down to actually being able to deliver. We've had lots of legislation so far. It's been frustrated all the way, so we want to get it right. We don't want to have another piece of legislation where basically it's challenged and it doesn't happen. So people expect results. They're not bothered how we do it. They just expect us to do it.
People aren't bothered how they do it. Will it work, Sonia?
It's not going to work. The Permanent Secretary of the Home Office wrote to Priti Patel in 2021 saying the government claims it's going to have a deterrent effect on the number of people trying to cross the channel in small boats. There's 2 things about that. First of all, there's a lot of push factors, and these are desperate people. Most of them come from countries like Syria, Afghanistan, Iran, where we know there are massive human rights abuses, where conflict is waged. But the issue with the deterrent effect thing as well is that the numbers we're talking about are too small. So the agreement with Rwanda is for 200 people a year for 5 years. Last year, you've got the figures in front of you there, almost 46,000 people arrived. So how is 200 people a year, even if it works, even if the courts eventually rule that it's legal? We don't know. That's still working its way through the system. How is 200 a year going to be a deterrent effect? So my view is that this policy is unethical. It's Britain shirking its international responsibilities under the 1951 Refugee Convention, but it's also not going to work. It's just the government trying to look tough and trying to look like it's doing something, but there's no evidence it's going to have any effect whatsoever.
Well, you mentioned the numbers there. We saw them briefly on the graph. Let's show them again. Migrants crossing the channel in small boats. You can see the jump there from 21 to 22, over 4,500. Will the policy, as outlined thus far, make a difference to those numbers, do you think?
We don't know. Look, first of all, those numbers are totally morally unacceptable. And actually, there's a consensus in Britain around that. There might be some people who are of the view, just let anyone come who wishes to come. They're very, very small in number. If you look at the history of how Labour and Conservative governments have tried to tackle this, they've both done similar things. And one reason why people are coming across the water is because Labour is quite successful at stopping them from coming across in vehicles.
That is true.
So whoever wins the next election, they're going to have to try to reduce that number. I think the problem is the European Convention on Human Rights. I think the problem is what you mentioned at the end there, which is our international obligations, and that whatever legislation the government passes, it's within the context of a perspective, a human rights consensus on one's right to apply that mitigates against almost anything the government tries to do. And I mean, you said absolutely it's going to work. How are you going to overcome the problem that you're going to be sued? And thus far, the government has been unable to fly anyone off to Rwanda. Are they not just raising hopes of something that can't actually be done because we're still operating within this human rights framework?
That's a fair point, Tim. And again, the Jamaica flights thing was another issue. People's right to a family life and so on has been brought up fairly often. But I don't think any one particular policy in isolation is going to solve the problem. I think you need a number of steps. So, for example, agreements with the Albanian government. We know a lot of the people coming across are male Albanian in their 20s or 30s. These are not refugees. These are economic migrants, the same as we need a good relationship with France. Pretty sure France don't want people transiting through their country as well. So there's a lot of different steps we've got to take.
Can I just step in there because this is why one has to be. I know one would like to distinguish between economic and political refugees, but one cannot. And the problem is that you may well say, right, Albanians, yes, they shouldn't be allowed here. One group should not be allowed here. But that's not how the law works. The law works in principle that anyone can apply for asylum. And what this...
Yeah, but so the answer to that is they should apply and their claims should be assessed. And one of the massive issues in the current system is that under this government, the delays have stretched and stretched and stretched. So I found this statistic staggering. 83% of asylum claims since 2018 are in limbo. That is crazy. If you're genuinely interested in upholding your international obligations and letting people who are genuinely fleeing torture and conflict come here and seek asylum, but at the same time saying no to people whose claims don't have a standing, then why wouldn't you be processing these people much, much more quickly? It's not fair to people seeking asylum, and it gums up the system.
To some extent, the government has tried, or is saying it's trying to answer that. The question is the deterrent. If you want to stop people, as Tim is saying, actually making the crossing in the first place, does the UK need to leave all of its international obligations behind to stop them coming in the first place?
No, we don't. Britain is a force for good in the world. We should be proud of our human rights record and the fact that we're a beacon internationally. To make sure that we have a working immigration system, though, we've got to process more than 1% of cases, as the government did last year. 99% of cases last year were not processed.
Yeah.
The £5 million a day being spent on hotel accommodation is a massive scandal, and it sits solely with the Home Office, who haven't done a deal with France, with a Conservative Party who questioned whether the French president was a friend or a foe, who haven't tackled criminal gangs and haven't got to grips with an immigration system which is bursting at the seams because they have not resourced it, they have not put the effort into solving those problems. And as a result, what we have here is yet again an assault by headline, assault by soundbite. It will not solve the problem. It will not provide safe routes for the people who are genuinely fleeing war and persecution. And I'm afraid we will still be here with even bigger figures because they're not getting to the heart and the root of the problem, which are those criminal gangs who are profiting from this incredible piece of human cruelty.
Brendan?
It's very easy to clear a backlog if you just say yes to everybody, which I think is what the opposition's approach is to this. But of course, when you say no and you actually want to remove people, that is the problem, because we're not able to remove people at the moment. It's these endless appeals. So we've changed the law to try and only get one appeal in there. Other countries manage to remove people. Why can't we? Is there a fundamental problem, a legal problem?
People currently, have you? That's one of the issues. We neither have safe routes to get people in, nor legal routes to deport people properly. That's why this immigration system is a mess. Wouldn't it be better to focus on what the problems actually are, the mishandling of this immigration system, rather than yet again another piece of legislation that won't solve the problem, just as the one last year, which was supposed to solve the problem, didn't solve the problem, and the one before that didn't solve the problem, but was supposed to solve the problem. Let's be honest about this. Let's fix the problem at source. That's the criminal gangs, that's an immigration system that's failing, and that's a lack of agreement with France.
Well, I agree about the criminal gangs. Certainly, that's something we've taken action on. But again, the Rwanda flight, we've not had a single person leave yet. So until that's actually done, it's very difficult to say whether that's going to work as a deterrent or not. We do have safe and legal ways to come over as an economic migrant.
The permanent secretary of the Home Office said there is no evidence. He wrote to Priti Patel and he said there's no evidence that there will be there's no significant evidence of a deterrent effect, and therefore he questioned the policy's value for money. That the permanent secretary of the Home Office said that.
Are you saying it's impossible then? We just simply cannot say no to people? Would that
no, I'm saying this is not an effective way. Of course we can say no to people. Your government, in 2021, your government only deported 113 people who had failed asylum claims. That's shockingly low. That's a part of the system that needs to be sorted out. And the government and the Home Office is in a complete mess. The system for processing these claims has totally broken down. The system for deporting people whose claims fail has broken down, and that is really wrong, because there are some people who absolutely legitimately have a claim to asylum here in the UK, and it's not fair to them, and it's not fair to citizens of this country either.
Right. I mean, where would you put, Brendan, all the tens of thousands of people, we looked at those numbers, claiming asylum, arriving here while they wait to be detained?
Well, this is the key, isn't it? It's the length of time that they're waiting, which is unacceptable. That's why we're trying to claim it.
Where would they stay?
Certainly not in hotels. I think a lot of the hotels around the country, coastal towns, not just coastal towns, are really, really suffering with this, and the impact on local services, the impact on the NHS it's having. So, I mean, we've looked at old military bases, we've looked at old holiday camps, we've looked at all sorts of different places. But I think the idea is it's the length of time that is the problem. And once we've made a decision on it, I mean, yes, there will be people absolutely genuine, we should be able to integrate those, give them a quick decision, and I think we all want to do that. We've done this with Ukraine, with Syria, with Afghanistan. We've taken many refugees in, but when we say no, we need to be able to remove people quickly.
Yeah, but some of those legal routes, for example, for people from Syria, have been removed. So the government is saying, well, you know, you can't come here on your own means. You can only come through a safe legal resettlement route. But lots of those resettlement routes have been taken away from the key countries around the world where there are refugees fleeing because of conflict and human rights abuses. So that is essentially Britain saying, well, we're not going to do the legal routes and we're going to deport people who arrive here to Rwanda. It is absolutely shirking our responsibility. We live in a world, I mean, it's age-old, the flow of people from conflict zones. There's always going to be a movement of people around the world. We have to find a way of coping with that. A really important piece of context is that the vast majority of refugees live in low and middle-income countries that are neighbours to their home country. It's quite a small proportion who end up coming to the West, to countries like Europe and the US. And we do have a legal obligation that we shouldn't be shirking.
Right, safe and legal routes. We hear that term all of the time. And it's true, there are schemes for Ukraine and for Hong Kong. They are quite sort of specialist and specialised in that particular sense. The question is, what would you do for people coming from Eritrea or Saudi Arabia or Iran? Are there going to be safe and legal routes for all of them?
Part of the problem, by the way, is it's difficult to operate safe and legal routes because they have to go to a third country first in order to apply. When you're dealing with a dictatorship or a catastrophic country like Eritrea, it's very difficult to operate that. But you're right, we do have safe and legal routes. It's just that they are targeted at, let's be honest, politically fashionable countries. Ukraine, Hong Kong and Afghanistan. Britain does not operate the same sort of policy towards Syria or towards Iran. And part of the reason for that is it's a numbers game. Asylum has always been an area in which governments have felt they can perhaps clip the numbers, take them down, rather than economic migration, which they welcome because they think it's good for the economy. The government's way around this is to say, look, let's not talk about the safe routes. They keep saying we'll have safe routes, but let's not talk about them. Let's talk about this one genuinely dangerous and immoral and illegal route, which is across the Channel, which, again, as I say, there is consensus about. But their strategy is to say, we are from now on going to say anyone who uses that route, you are automatically deemed to not have a right to be here, and you'll be moved to Rwanda, not for your application to be processed, but for you to apply for asylum within Rwanda. And what I'm saying is, under the current human rights framework under which we operate, that's not how asylum works.
And it's not going to work for that reason. So are you suggesting that the UK does leave the European Convention on Human Rights and any other international agreement?
Well, the government's confident that it will work, but of course, if it's not, the debate about the ECHR. Now, when I knock on doors in my constituency, people don't say they desperately want to leave the ECHR. They do say they want us to deal with the small boats and illegal immigration.
So what do you think?
Well, if it's a means to an end, if we can do it without leaving, then fine. If we find out that we'll have to leave, then I'm open to that as well. I think we need to keep that on the table.
I have to ask, if a mother and child washed up on these shores, what would you do with them? Under the government's legislation.
From France.
From France. They arrived on these shores from France. They go straight to Rwanda?
Well, I think you'd have to treat it on a case-by-case basis. So you would obviously look at their case and you would hope that it would be dealt with in a fair way. And then if it was not economic migration...
No, that's not what's being suggested today.
By the way, it doesn't apply to women and children. I'm sorry, I gave an unfair example there. Because actually the Rwandan plan doesn't apply to some groups. But
it's true, but if people arrive on UK shores, the government, the suggestion is that they will be banned altogether and they will be sent to a third country, whether that's Rwanda or somewhere else. And you're signed up to that?
I'm perfectly fine with that. I mean, I put another scenario. You know, we just took the citizenship of
Shamima Begum. If
Shamima Begum came on a small boat and arrived in this country, would we be able to remove her with the way things currently are? Probably not, and this is the problem.
Because she's a British citizen. I'm sorry, you can't just rewrite the human rights principles upon which everything operates because of one localise a temporary problem. That's the problem with all of this. And you keep trying and you keep failing because you can't do it because we're a nation of laws.
But when the human rights legislation was there, when people signed up to it, and of course we played a key role in actually crafting a lot of this, you know, it was not meant to circumvent countries' immigration laws. And I think a lot of the problem here is it's about fairness. People are open to genuine refugees, but what people are not open to is that when they feel cheated and that sense of fairness has been taken away.
But what you do in that situation is you assess people's asylum claims, you assess them quickly based on the evidence, and you deport people who don't have a fair asylum claim. The issue is is that most people who come on small boats, they're from countries with very, very high levels of successful asylum claims. So most people who come on the small boats do have a legitimate claim to asylum.
All right. Let's have a look at this headline. We're going to move on and talk about Sue Gray. You may remember Sue Gray. She was the senior civil servant tasked with investigating Partygate, lockdown gatherings. This headline, Sue Gray to tell government watchdog when job talks with Labour began. That's because she has quit her role as a senior civil servant on Thursday after reports came out that she is going to take a job as Keir Starmer, the Labour leader's chief of staff. And as I say, she investigated lockdown gatherings. Now, on LBC Radio this morning, Keir Starmer was asked many times about when he first approached Sue Gray to be his chief of staff. Let's have a listen.
Can I ask when you approached Sue?
Look,
if I may call her Sue?
I've been looking for a chief of staff for a number of weeks now.
I think October 2022, Sam White left you, if I've got
Well,
that
that's when I lost, when Sam White moved on.
We'll try again, and obviously you don't have to answer, but when did you first contact Sue Gray about the possibility of becoming your chief of staff?
Well, Nick, that's going to be laid out by Sue. She's got to do that as part of a leaving procedure, but there's nothing improper at all.
But you can't tell me that.
Nick, nothing improper at all.
But if it's not improper, I'm sorry to... If it's not improper, why won't you say, it was a month ago, Nick, or it was 6 weeks ago, Nick, or it was on New Year's Day?
It was. I've been looking for some time, and there's nothing improper in the slightest.
Well, if there is nothing improper, as Nick Ferrari said, why won't Keir Starmer just say?
Well, Keir Starmer and Sue Gray are two people who love rules, who love process, who love decency and upholding high standards.
Yeah.
I have no doubt that the official process has been followed and, importantly, must be followed now. And that is what Sue Gray and the Labour Party are following.
Right. But why won't he just be drawn on it? Why won't he say we've been in talks for a few weeks, a month?
Well, one of the clips that you didn't show from the LBC interview is when Keir said any of the conversations took place after the Sue Gray report was published.
Right.
And so,
so why won't he say then? If there's nothing to answer, why won't he just say so?
Well, I think both Sue Gray and Keir Starmer want to follow the correct procedure. The correct procedure in this case is to follow the Cabinet Office procedures, which lays out when a senior civil servant leaves the government, the civil service, to take another job, what are the rules that should be followed there? Now, this is heavy on process, but I really, honestly don't think there is a smoking gun here. These are two people who are decent, are upholding high standards, who are following the correct process.
Right, but then is that line sustainable? Because people will just say, what's he hiding? What's Keir Starmer hiding? Why can't he give us a date?
Well, Sue Gray will give that date to the watchdog. That process will happen very soon, possibly even this week. And so we're getting to a sense where we'll have the answers on this. But look, I'm really glad that someone of Sue Gray's calibre wants to join.
Well, that's a different question and topic altogether.
But it's a departure from the rule breaking that we've seen under the current government, where Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak were both fined for attending illegal lockdown parties. That they've apologised for the findings of the Sue Gray report that found them to have illegal lockdown parties, found a culture that was rotten inside Downing Street.
All right.
And what Keir's done is, by taking someone with the highest levels of probity, the highest levels of integrity, and recognised on a cross-party basis, that's a very clear departure from the rule-breaking of the past and a clear signal that the next Labour government will uphold and maintain high levels of integrity and decency.
Well, you're sure no rules have been broken contractually or otherwise in terms of hiring Sue Gray. Can you understand the concerns of civil servants who believe that their impartiality is now being questioned?
Well, it's quite normal that civil servants leave the civil service and go on to different jobs, and that's why there is this process.
Only quit on Thursday, and it came out that she had taken this high-profile role with Labour, had come out that day or just before.
Well, she's not the first civil servant to leave the civil service
That's absolutely
to take on a political job afterwards, and that is why there is this process. There is a clear process set out. It is one that should maintain high levels of integrity. I'm absolutely convinced that will happen here. It will probably include a large period of gardening leave to make sure there, and restrictions, as
could be up to 3 years or 2 years after the next general election.
Well, I mean, Sue Gray is a fantastic person with high levels of integrity. I don't doubt that. She enjoys cross-party support. And for the amount of Conservative MPs who use the phrase, we're waiting for Sue Gray, and then a plethora of compliments about how good and decent she was, to suddenly do a 180-degree turn at this point here, it's just a distraction to divert attention from the rule breaking.
Well, I mean, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a performance worse than Manchester United yesterday, but Keir Starmer's managed it this morning. I mean, why can't you just answer the question? If it's all above board, then just say when you've entered into negotiations and You know, I have worked with Sue Gray, and like many civil servants, you know, I would never question their impartiality. I think they do a very good job. They get a lot of stick for it, but we respect that, and it's really important to have that separation. But at the same time, I think this is a terrible error of judgment from Keir Starmer, because this puts a lot of pressure on our civil servants to go from what is really quite a senior civil service role to something that is really overtly political at such a sensitive time.
It happens all the time, Brendan. As we've heard, there are various examples of people moving either from the diplomatic service or the civil service to go and work for political parties.
Well, people gave the example of David Frost. Now, David Frost actually left the civil service for a number of years. He was then a special advisor, a political role, and then things came later. He didn't switch straight from being in the civil service to go for something that's controversial as this.
Why do you object? What's the problem?
OK, I've got no problem with people having private political beliefs, and as I say, people are very professional. It should be followed in the correct manner. Now, to suddenly announce that someone's going to work for the leader of the opposition, now, civil servants are privy to some quite sensitive information, especially with the workings of government, how ministers plan. They need that. They need to know that that can be kept private. I'm not suggesting that that's not the case, but of course the perception is there, and I think it looks very, very bad, especially Boris Johnson has his privileges committee coming up. Now, some have tried to make it all about that. It's not. It is the wider principle here of the separation of the civil service and politics. Keir Starmer's muddied the waters, and I think he's done the civil service a great disservice in doing so.
Sonia?
I think that distinction between the civil service and political advice is a bit overblown, actually. I think in practice, the boundaries are quite fuzzy. I think you get very senior civil servants who work very closely with politicians. Sir Bernard Ingram, for example, he was a civil servant who worked very, very closely with Margaret Thatcher. So I'm actually quite relaxed about it. I think it does happen a lot. I think when you take a step back, to the extent that anyone in the real world is paying attention to this, what the signal it gives is actually, well, Keir Starmer is really serious about the business of preparing for government. And I think that's really, really important for an opposition that's doing well in the polls to take seriously. And secondly, well, a senior civil servant of Sue Gray's calibre now rates Labour's chances of winning the next election so highly that she's prepared to step away from this job security of a civil service role to go and work for the leader of the opposition. It's very clear she's not going to be in a very, very avidly political role. She's not going to be running the next general election campaign. She clearly doesn't have the experience for that. Her experience is how do you make government work? How do you enact policy? I expect that is exactly why Starmer's employed her.
Well, the irony is that these two experienced paragons of virtue have between them accidentally helped to restore a little of Boris Johnson's reputation. Because, of course, he was brought down by Sue Gray. And at the time, he accepted her findings, by the way.
And he said she was a woman of probity.
Said she was, again, another paragon of virtue. But now that now she's flipped over to Labour, it's inevitably going to feed a narrative that actually the whole Partygate thing was stirred up by partisan civil servants. Now, it doesn't matter if that's true or not. This is politics. Politics is all about perception.
The only person that brought down Boris Johnson was Boris Johnson. His support for Chris Pincher, his support for Owen Paterson,
and
then the illegal lockdown parties.
But what about perception?
I agree with
you. About perception.
Right. Well, what is the perception? But what is the perception?
I just don't think that perception is going to land with the public. The evidence is so clearly out there that that rules and laws were broken in Downing Street. There've been police fines. We've got photos, for goodness' sake.
But if the judge in a court
hang on, Sonia's mentioned them. Let's have a look at the photos.
Immediately after the court case, went and took a job with the person who brought the accusation, we'd all say, well, that doesn't look terribly good, does it? And that's essentially what's happened. Look, I don't dispute her own ability. The problem is that we are going to have to rely upon her being a good person, that she will not share classified information, that she won't hand over her experience and her contacts from having worked at the top, that the fact that she's been working at the very top of British government won't have the slightest impact upon Keir Starmer, and he will not in any way use that. We have to rely upon her decency as a civil servant in that case.
Well, talking of your perception, you've mentioned the photos. They've been released to the Privileges Committee that are looking into whether or not Boris Johnson misled Parliament, because we knew and know that he broke the rules because he received a fixed penalty notice for it. We might be able to show them again, Brendan, because I'd like you to have a look at them. For those of your colleagues and Conservatives who feel that it delegitimises the Partygate inquiry, when you look at these images, what do you think? Do you think Boris Johnson didn't realise he was at a gathering or a party, whether Sue Gate oversaw it or not?
Well, that's at a workplace, and I don't call a jug of orange juice and some sandwiches a party. I call that lunch.
Bottles of Prosecco, by the looks of it.
I would say that's very different. But at the same time, we've been through this, and people have been fined for various things. They've been separate things from where Boris Johnson has been there. But when you are a minister or a prime minister or a secretary of state and you're giving a statement to the House, you're relying on that information that you've been given. Now, sometimes that's wrong. You come back, you correct the record, but you do that to the best of your knowledge. What I don't like about what's happening to Boris Johnson, and we mentioned if this were a court of law, this would be thrown out now. There's that presumption of innocence before you've, actually, this is the opposite way around.
Well, should Boris Johnson still be Prime Minister, in your view?
Well, this is different because it's not just about that one issue, and people know I was a strong supporter of Boris Johnson. I think there's the perception now that people want to stitch him up and throw him out as an MP. But I think really the Sue Gray scandal now and what Keir Starmer has brought this to, it's about more than Partygate. It's about the whole civil service and about how we see civil servants. So I think if we make it about Partygate and the Privileges Committee, it kind of misses a bit of the point there. Yes, that's going on, and we know that, and that's old ground. There's a much bigger issue at here play.
But when you looked at that photo of Boris Johnson at illegal lockdown parties and you tried to say, oh, it was just some orange juice and some sandwiches, why are you not saying that was wrong? That was wrong. People that I represent, that you represent, did the right thing. They stayed at home. They followed the rules. The Prime Minister who made the rules broke them. And you looked at that photo and you didn't say, that's an illegal gathering. I am sorry that took place. I am a Conservative MP and I'm sorry. That's what you should have said. That's what you should have said when you saw that photo. And you decided to throw some mud around on Sue Gray and on others to try and protect Boris Johnson. That really isn't good enough, Brendan.
The Prime Minister is at work there, and also what I would say is the Prime Minister was fined on for one incident. Of course, Rishi Sunak was also fined for that. Now, if I knock on the doors again of my constituents, I do not know a single one that certainly the Rishi Sunak fine felt that was fair. I think that's very unfair. You can contest that, but we're talking about something different.
Well, hang on, let me bring to
Luke, when you enter government in a few months' time, which you will have to do so trusting that the civil servants you are dealing with are completely politically non-biased. Now, if in the course of working with them, you found one of them quit their job and went and worked with the leader of the opposition, would that not cause you to cast some doubt upon the objectivity of the institution that is so critical to good government?
Well, having worked with the civil service in the past, I know that there are people who are, in their private lives, would vote Labour. I know there are some that would vote Conservative and some that would vote elsewhere. The point is, these are professional people at work doing their best to uphold the integrity of the civil service and advise ministers in the best way they can. The reason we have a process for people who leave the civil service to take other jobs, including in business, where they could use their knowledge for the benefit, their personal benefit and of their employers, is to make sure they understand what their responsibilities are, what the correct process is, and to make sure that appointment is proper.
Why not go to Aqaba first rather than announce that Sue Gray is joining the Labour Party then? It seems to have been done very back to front, that we've got this announcement and we're now trying to find out whether it's ethical or done at the right time or when Keir Starmer made that contact. So it's been done in a very back-to-front way, and I think that's why people want to know, when was that initial contact made? And why is it a problem to reveal that?
And no doubt we will find out in due course, maybe before the actual application is lodged. We're going to talk about the inquest that has concluded into the shooting in Plymouth, in which 5 people were killed. It's the worst mass shooting in Britain since 2010. A 22-year-old gunman, Jake Davison, then killed himself. Let's just have a look at the news report from that day.
Good evening. A vigil has been held tonight in memory of the 5 people killed by a gunman in Plymouth in the UK's worst mass shooting in over 10 years. The dead include the mother of the gunman, who was the first to die, and a 3-year-old girl, Sophie Martin, who'd been out for a walk with her father, who was also shot dead.
Plymouth is hurting tonight. In this neighbourhood, everyone knows one another. So finding out who the victims were has only made things more painful.
You're the MP for the area, and it must have been, and it was, a terrible, terrible shock to your constituents. What was the impact on the community?
Oh, it's been this intense trauma from the moment the shooting happened, and it continues. We lost 5 members of our community, 2 people were shot and survived, but we have hundreds of people, literally hundreds of people, including many children, who watched someone get shot with a pump-action shotgun on the streets. This is something that the strong sense in Plymouth is that we never want to see repeated anywhere again. So to do that, we have to learn the lessons from what happened, the police failings, but also tackle that toxic underbelly on the internet, that incel culture, that violent misogyny and hatred of women that may have informed the actions of the killer here.
Explain to our viewers what incel culture is. You're quite right, there were police failings, but there was this ideology that was seen to have driven this man to commit those crimes. What is it?
Well, very few people before the shootings took place really understood what an incel was. An incel is someone who's involuntary celibate. That's celebrating the fact that they can't maintain a relationship with a woman, or blaming women for their lack of sex or lack of relationship. And it very quickly can breadcrumb into a violent association with women and a real hatred of women. Now, that is potentially what is happening, not just in the case in Plymouth, but in bedrooms up and down the country, where our young men in particular are looking at content, be it Andrew Tate, be it other types of violent misogyny, and then going down a rabbit hole to get to even more disturbing, toxic masculinity, disturbing, toxic examples of incel violence in the UK and in America. And that is radicalising a whole generation of young people. And frankly, we don't have a plan as to how we tackle that.
Should there be a plan, Brendan? Should the government be looking at a way of specifically targeting incel culture?
So it should certainly be on the radar, yes. And Luke and I have disagreed on many things today, and this is something that I'm sure colleagues across the House will agree with him on, that this needs to be tackled, and mentioned appalling people such as Andrew Tate, this sort of wider misogyny in society. But obviously the coroner's report's going to come out, and we'll see what's there and what we can do about that. But there's certainly a lot of support for getting something together and making sure a tragedy like this can never happen again.
Right. I mean, there have been calls that perhaps it should be classed as terrorism, extremism of that kind. I mean, do you think there's a legislative response, Tim, to this kind of thing, or societal in that sense?
I would say societal was better, because it's very difficult to define and to police bad attitudes. Now, by saying that, I'm not giving any leeway to those bad attitudes. They are appalling. And it's a very distressing thing that in our culture, which today is healthily feminist in many ways, there is beneath the radar and beneath the perception of mainstream culture this misogyny, violent misogyny, which probably finds some expression through pornography, by the way, which is still being articulated and still is out there. Something needs to be done. But where I'm cautious about governments getting involved, as I say, is whenever governments get involved in defining a problem and then policing it, you can get an overreach that could possibly produce an adverse reaction. I'm thinking of the government's prevent strategy for the last 20 years towards the Muslim community, where after 9/11, the government got into the business of defining what is a good or a bad Muslim and then policing it. They may well, in the course of doing that, have saved some lives, by the way. But in the course of doing that, they also alienated a community and possibly did some harm. And I'm reluctant to give government the go-ahead to do that. I just to say, I'm personally philosophically of the view that in this country you should largely be left alone unless you pose a direct threat to someone else. And I'm not comfortable about giving government powers or encouragement to go prying into people's privacy and their souls.
Sonia?
I actually don't think that's true if you look at Prevent and Prevent's reputation amongst the broad group of British Muslims as opposed to just certain groups. So if you look at polling, actually, most British Muslims will say they support the principles of Prevent, and I think that's really important. The thing to realise is we know that online radicalisation, whether it's far-right extremism, and Prevent does a lot of work around far-right ideology as well, whether it's Islamist or whether it's incel ideology, and incel ideology isn't included in this, we know that that is sometimes associated with these horrific incidents. But it's not just the incidents, it's not just terrorist incidents like the one that we saw in Plymouth. It's also the harm that it does to young people who are being groomed and radicalised online. And if you look at what's going on with incel ideology, there are similarities with far-right grooming, with Islamist grooming. What happens is a boy might go onto YouTube, ask an innocent question, question, you know, what is feminism? The first video that he might see might be Emma Watson speaking at the UN. Within 4 or 5 videos that have been pushed to him, he'll be watching really kind of extremist stuff. This is an issue. And actually, if you look at terrorism, and if you look at far-right terrorism and Islamist terrorism, often the people committing these crimes, the men committing these crimes, the one thing they have in common is a track record of domestic abuse and violent hatred of women. And I think we need to worry about this, first of all, because there is that link that people like Joan Smith have evidence, but secondly, because it's not just about this very tragic, very rare event in Plymouth. 3 women a week are killed by men in this country. And that's through things like domestic abuse, for example. It happens behind closed doors. It's very below the radar. What is this doing? The fact that our boys are being inculcated into this stuff online, what does that do? Pornography as well, that's an issue. What does that do in terms of their attitudes and relationships to women? Now, I understand it's very difficult to do concrete things about it, and some of the response has to be societal. It has to be about how we're inoculating boys against this stuff online, what schools are doing, etc. But I think at the moment, incel ideology is treated very differently to far-right terrorism and to Islamist terrorism, and actually I think it would send a very important signal for it to be put on a level footing. And if 3 men a week were being killed, you know, behind closed doors, the government would be investing a lot more money into trying to prevent that than it does around domestic abuse.
Tim?
There's a lot to discuss there, and one has to be as sensitive about it as possible. So, on the question of the number of people being killed, is this in part a failing of the police not doing their job under the laws that currently exist? We know, for instance, there have been people who've gone on to kill women who have exposed themselves in public, and they've not been properly investigated. We've had police officers who've carried out violence, and they've not been properly investigated. Is this that to me strikes me as something that we can begin by saying, are we actually effectively enforcing the law as it is? But you mentioned, for instance, videos on YouTube. First of all, that to me is about parents policing kids, saying you don't get internet access for certain times of the day, or it is supervised. But also, what videos come down? What is your test for what is misogynistic? How do we define that? Who polices it? This just sounds like it's going to very easily flip over into a very broad-based censorship.
Well, I think, I do agree that there are risks there, but I think the question has to be, so these algorithms that push these videos to young people, they're not neutral. YouTube pushes these videos because it makes it money. So we have to think, and it is a very, very difficult sort of thorny question, I agree with you, but we have to think about how we regulate these platforms, because they are making money out of pushing hateful content.
We will talk about this time and again in the future. Thank you, obviously, for giving us the background in your community. We've just got time to look at this story, BBC News story by my colleague Ione Wells, political correspondent. Dominic Raab, Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary. Ex-colleagues speak out as the bullying probe reaches final stages. Unless you've been under a rock, of course, you will know that this has been going on for some time, looking at allegations against Dominic Raab in terms of bullying. Ione Wells has talked to a number of people. She's with us now. Give us the background to this.
Well, Jo, this investigation's been going on for over 3 months now, and it's looking into 8 formal complaints from Dominic Raab's time at 3 different government departments involving, we know, at least 24 different complainants. Now, these are all being investigated by the senior lawyer Adam Tolley KC, and as part of his evidence gathering, he has been speaking to dozens of people who've worked with Dominic Raab over the years, interviewed Dominic Raab himself, as well as some of the top civil servants who have run government departments with him.
Right, what about the people you've been speaking to? What have they been telling you?
Well, these people aren't complainants, as those people can't speak publicly while this inquiry is ongoing, but people who have worked with him in a senior capacity. Somebody who advised him in a senior role in one government department says while they weren't personally bullied, they have no question that what they witnessed was bullying, and said he could be belittling, he could be angry and offensive at the flick of a switch to people, but also that his behaviour had an impact on policy as well as people, because some junior officials, they claim, were protected from being exposed to him, and therefore, in their words, he shut up people who were supposed to be advising him. Now, somebody else who was a former parliamentary staff member told me that while they didn't think he was necessarily a bully, they had witnessed him make people cry and literally rip up people's work at times. But then others have had very positive experiences. One parliamentary staffer who his team put us in touch with said they only had good things to say. And separately, an official who has given evidence to the inquiry was also saying that he was a good boss, even if he was a perfectionist and very focused.
And when's it going to report? Very briefly.
We're expecting the report very soon. It is in its final stages. And of course, Dominic Raab himself has strongly denied claims of bullying.
He has. Ione Wells, thank you very much for bringing us that. That's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the BBC iPlayer. Please join us then. Bye-bye.